Hey there. Okay, so back at it, trying to explain some spiritual truths and how they translate into everyday life and politics and what have you. And I know that most people don't care to be deep thinkers. Most people are not philosophical. Uh, and I also know that some of those who go to church and who claim to be Christians don't like to think deeply even about what the Bible says, and sometimes they even read scriptures and try to convince themselves that it didn't come from God because it doesn't make them feel good. Like everything God has to say is going to make them feel good, even though God said, correctly so, of course, that His thoughts are higher than our thoughts, His ways are higher than our ways. But yeah, so people try to claim that God only says things that make them feel good, even though the Bible is full of instances of God killing dissenters who either dissented against him or against his appointed and anointed person. Okay, so there's a lot about today's ecumenical church or recumenical church, as I like to call it sometimes, that just doesn't make sense. So, and there's just a lot in the world as a whole that just doesn't make sense. A lot of politicians don't make sense. Thank God we got rid of one of the most senseless politicians. He got replaced with Joe Biden. Uh, and I'm not real gung ho about Joe Biden either. But I think that during Trump's White House residency, that the wheels of destruction got set in motion in a very big way. But rather than me going off on a tangent about how crazy Trump was, let me just go ahead and say that in previous videos in this playlist that I'm putting together, um, I mentioned that there are 10 spheres of thought that a person can be born with. The ninth sphere, the second most powerful, being rationale. The 10th sphere, the most powerful, being conceptual thought that compartmentalizes everything. You can look at the previous videos to hear more about that. But I also mentioned that there's an 11th sphere of thought that can be developed sometime after birth. Uh, Takes a considerable amount of hardship in life to get you there. But it is what I call the God element. Uh, and a person who develops it basically develops a concept of life that they try to push out toward others, and that you see that sort of thinking in dictators and in some elected officials, even in this country. You don't, I mean, across its borders, you probably have people that have made the level in almost every country, but you also see it in comedians and others that have the bully mic, if you will. Uh, but so I explained that that's the level of thought where you're no longer just taking in people's ideas about what life should be like. You've compartmentalized your thoughts uh, beyond what that 10th sphere of thought does. The 10th sphere, you just compartmentalize what kinds of things happen in the world around you, in the universe around you, and society, and then you govern yourself accordingly. But in this instance, that 11th sphere kind of builds on that, where it's still a conceptualized area of thought, but you're not conceptualizing the way the world is. You're conceptualizing the way you think it should be. But anyway, so you can go to the previous videos in this playlist in order to hear more about that. But then I got to something where I had a little bit of difficulty explaining it, not because I don't know what I believe, not because I don't know what I've thought through dozens and dozens of times, but because I know, as you may know by now, that I can be very long-winded, and I think about a lot of things, and if I don't try to rein myself in, then it's going to take 40, 50 or more hours of video like this to get my thoughts across. And so I'm kind of hoping that maybe the last couple of videos that I make for this playlist, which are no longer than, well, they're just under 27 minutes, because my phone cuts the video after 26 minutes and 51 seconds, and somehow another second gets added when I upload it. But be that as it may, I'm limited in how long the video can be, and try to get this thing off of my screen. Okay, so I'm 6 minutes and 47 seconds in. So this area of thought that or this spiritual level that I had a little bit of trouble explaining in short form anyway, is that 12th sphere, that 12th level. I actually didn't bother with the first 6. I started with the 7th. But anyway, that 12th sphere kind of comes after that God element, as I call it. And it actually does correspond with a part of the mind that the several death angels, I believe, exist. I know the Bible mentions one in particular. It doesn't actually give it a name other than calling it the death angel, but then later on in Revelation you read about the 7 thunders, and I'm just kind of guessing that the 7 thunders are actually 7 death angels who have always, for their entire existence, had this 12th sphere of thought in their minds, and causes them to think objectively about universal truths, and I mean universal as in the universe, the cosmos, and death, destruction is actually a major aspect of this general spiritual phenomenon that just hovers in the universe. I mean, maybe I should borrow from Obi-Wan Kenobi, that it is the force that is all around you and is in you and runs through you, however he said that. Yeah, and so anyway, like I said in previous videos, or at least one, that I believe that God actually realized that he needed to consider this. That I believe there was a point where he was just kind of hovering out there in the vastness, emptiness of space. It might have always been black. He might have made it black. I don't know. All we know is what our hands have touched. God himself said that somewhere in the Bible. We know what our hands have touched. We don't know about these things that are far above and beyond us. We're exploring space, but we've only seen the tip of the iceberg. But anyway, I believe that there was a point where God actually was just kind of hovering out there in the blackness of space, or the whiteness of space, whatever the color it was, and and he was actually I got a little notification on my screen about a news item, but he was just kind of hovering out there as a disembodied soul. He wasn't even embodied. Didn't have eyes, ears, nose, mouth, arms, legs, um, because he actually jumped up the body and then proceeded to create it. And I believe he actually had to embody himself, had to think about what it would be made of and how it would function and that sort of stuff. And he thought of all creation before he went on to actually create it. I don't think he just always had uh, certain things and just copied them. Of course, he didn't give us all of what he's got because he's an eternal being, but he made us flesh. And he said in the Bible, you're only flesh. You're not made of the stuff I'm made of. You're not made of what heavenly beings are made of. You're only made of flesh. You're a carbon-based life form. Yeah, and so, in any instance, I believe that God just kind of hovered out there as a disembodied soul, just a sphere of consciousness, a very powerful sphere of consciousness. And that if you could have been there and you could have seen it, he might have just looked like a bright star off in the distance. Uh, but of course, you couldn't have been there because he didn't create anybody yet. He had to hover as this disembodied soul and just think everything through and then proceed to create it. And I believe that he came to the realization that there is a force out there outside of his being, and that force is something that I'll just call universal law. Not universal in the sense that it stands true from state to state or country to country, but universal as in it fills the cosmos. And I also mentioned that I believe that the first and the second universal order imploded, uh, and that there was no way for God to avoid it. So it's not a matter of finding any fault with him. There were just things that had to happen, uh, and the logic of the universe, of the cosmos itself, says that in the second order, God would naturally choose to do the opposite of various things he did in the first order, and that after the destruction of the second order, that after everything imploded, then uh, he would be forced to realize that you can't just use a toggle switch. You can't just go from Democrat to Republican, Republican back to Democrat. You know that you actually have to reason things out and think about how one thing leads to another, and how if I do items 1, 2, and 3 now, then 10 years from now, this is the effect it's going to have. 100 years, 1,000 years, 10,000 years out, this is what's going to happen. Okay, and so it actually changed the dynamic, not just of God's thought, but of thought in general. And now that we are in the third universal order, um, all life basically has to, at the very least, be rational. Uh, and there are levels of thought that are weaker than rationale. Um, so the 6 that I didn't mention, the first 2 that I did mention, and then rationale is actually that ninth sphere of thought, and it goes up from there. So, and I also mentioned how that when you go to the book of Revelation, chapter 6, and you read about the apocalyptic horsemen, that in order, the 4 of them, well, they each correspond with multiple things, but one of the things that each of them corresponds with is the 4 most powerful spheres of thought that the mind can have. So, rationale, conceptual thought. There's God element that can be developed after birth, a number of years after birth, not immediately after birth, and then this final one that I'll just call death. Uh, when you look at the four horsemen, he says, the first was given a crown and went out conquering and to conquer. The way that a person can use their rationale to conquer nature and conquer various obstacles in the world around them. But it's not a warring element, it's just conquering your circumstances and developing the ability to sustain life. Your life, the lives of your dependents, the lives of the citizens in the nation that you lead. And then there's that second horseman, and his horse was red, and he was given power to make war, and that corresponds with the man's conceptual thought. And then that third one is a black horse, and his rider was given a set of balances and went out saying a measure of wheat for a day's wages, 3 measures of barley for a day's wages. That represents low return on investment, and it even says something about God and how that he has a low return on his investment in the world in terms of trying to get people to think harder and think themselves into godhood. And he knows that most people just aren't going to make the mark. And that's why he gave us that particular vision within this revelation. It just goes with the territory. And then the fourth horse was a pale horse, and its rider's name was Death. And the scripture actually says the least about this fourth horseman, just that his rider's name was Death, and then it goes on to say, and Hades followed close behind. So this 12th spear of thought, this fourth horseman, Death, so it actually corresponds with, well, destruction, death, obviously, but it's death on multiple levels, and not all levels will necessarily occur at the same time. So that brings you back to God and the destruction of the first two universal orders, and so everything just imploded, and God had created some things, I'm quite sure, and when the stress level got too high, that's the primary law of the universe, is that you got to have love, and if too many of God's creatures are stressed out, then the universe just pushes from the outside in and balls everything up. It's kind of like the first half of the Big Bang, if you will, and then God had to start over on a second universal order, a third universal order, and this one will last. God's got everything figured out, and like I say, the first two had to implode in order for us to get to a place where rationale became the lowest common denominator for people to sustain life. And if you can't function at that level or higher, then you're universally insignificant, basically, if you can't be rational. I'm talking about stuff that people generally don't talk about, and it's kind of hard to figure out how to explain it sometimes, but I'm still going to do what I can to get us there. So, anyway, after this fourth apocalyptic horse, Death, Hades follows close behind. Now, So you might ask, well, what's the difference between death and Hades, or after you die, then you go to Hades. But actually, I think that Hades doesn't just mean hell, doesn't just mean a place where you burn eternally, but you can have hell on earth. Life can be full of Hades, and that brings me right back to what I always say about God being a God of necessary evils. Long before I started shooting the videos in this playlist, I talked a lot about God being a God of necessary evils. I mean, you can go to Facebook and you can do a search for my name and for the words necessary evils, and you'll get a whole lot of entries where I say something about God being a God of necessary evils. And that's something I really make it a point to drill into people. I tell them how that my favorite verse is Isaiah 45:7. How form light and create darkness, I make good and create evil. I, the Lord, do all these things. But I also believe that God does these necessary evils. The word necessary is important because, you see, God knows what types of things can lead to a total implosion of all life in the universe. And in order to make sure that doesn't happen, God has come up with a master plan, and that master plan includes him doing evil. And that's why he told King Cyrus, I form light and create darkness, I make good and create evil. I, the Lord, do all these things. And there are some hurtful things that he has to do in order for life to continue. And if you go to the book of Job, I'm not going to take you through the story, but I'm going to tell you very briefly that the main point in the book is that you don't have to be doing evil for God to bring hardship upon you, even allowing most of your loved ones to be killed by Satan, allowing you to lose all your wealth, lose all your livestock, or whatever. So it wasn't a matter of punishment, but God, he just has some evil things factored into his plan, and that's just what he does. And he decided that for some reason that it was a good idea to let Satan do all this harm to Job, and God actually was, shall we say, refereeing the process. He was setting the parameters, telling Satan, okay, don't touch his body in round one, and then in round two, okay, touch his body, but don't kill him. And I love to tell people how that God didn't give a rat's ass about Job's children dying or Job's servants dying or his livestock for that matter. But he didn't want Job dead. Okay, and I'm pretty sure Job's dead now, but even so, at that time he didn't want Job dead. So let me see, and I'm at 23 and a half minutes already. But yeah, so God, what's I going to say before I get to the limit here? So I believe that God is actually working on getting a small fraction, probably a fraction of a percentage of the world population to think themselves into godhood. And he's going to use this very small fraction of a percentage of people and make them eternal leaders. And some of them are mentioned in the Bible. There's Jesus, who's mentioned by name, the English version anyway. People like to tell me that there's no J in the Hebrew language. Okay, I get that, but I'm speaking English. Okay, so there is a J in English. And so there's Jesus, there are the 144,000. I believe there are two groups of 144,000. Even as Jesus was the second Adam, there's a second group of 144,000. The first group is referenced in Genesis chapter 6. They're the ones whose sons became Nephilim, even though it's not clearly stated that there were 144,000 of them. And in Revelation 14:4, it describes the 144,000. It says, "These are they who follow the Lamb whithersoever he goeth, for these are they who are not defiled by the women of the world." And so I believe there's a connection there. And there's also some scripture in the book of Jude, which is actually one chapter and precedes Revelation, where it says that Enoch prophesied, saying, "I saw the Lord coming with his 10,000s of servants." I think they might not have just been a prophecy. He might have actually seen the first group of 144,000 being dropped off. And then even as Adam failed this test and Jesus got a harder test, which he passed, the first group of 144,000 failed their test. And then the second group got a harder test, probably slavery. They were probably chosen when the Hebrews were slaves, I would imagine. I could be wrong on that, but anyway, the first appointee for the job that God has fails. The second one gets a harder test. Okay, and that seems to be a bit of a pattern. But this time is that the earth exists. It's really about God raising up a few good leaders, a few good men, like the Marines like to say, and then after that's done, he'll set everyone up in their positions and set the world free, and we get to live in peace under Jesus Christ.